Commander Zaelvok stood on the bridge of his warship, the silencing blade, and watched the human colony burn beneath him like a dying candle in the dark of space. He was tall even by the standards of the Vaethir, standing nearly 7 feet, with scales the color of ash, and eyes like 2 chips of frozen amber that never blinked unless he wanted them to. His officers moved around him in quiet discipline, their clawed hands dancing across control panels, as orbital defense stations around the planet crumbled, one after another, like toys crushed under a boot. "Their shields are down," his second-in-command reported, a younger officer named Thrak, who still had the eagerness of someone who had not yet grown bored of conquest. "Of course they are," Zaelvok said without turning his head. "This is a farming colony, Thrak, not a fortress." He said the word farming the way someone might say insect, with mild disgust and complete disinterest. Was called Outpost Kepler 9c, and it sat on a temperate world at the far edge of space that the Vaethir Dominion considered rightfully theirs. Around 4,000 humans lived there, mostly families and engineers who spent their days turning alien soil into something that could grow wheat and corn and other soft things that soft creatures needed to survive. The Vaethir had studied humans for nearly a standard year before this attack, and everything in the intelligence reports made Zaelvok feel like he was about to step on an anthill. Humans had no claws, no venom, no natural armor, no ability to regenerate limbs or filter toxins through their skin. Their bodies were laughably fragile. A single fall from a moderate height could shatter their bones, and their skin could be cut by something as simple as a piece of short paper. Zaelvok had conquered 63 civilizations in his career, and he had never seen a species that looked more like prey. Gave the order, and drop pods screamed down through the atmosphere like metal rain. Vaethir soldiers poured out onto the colony's surface in disciplined waves, their dark armor gleaming under the alien sun, their weapons humming with energy that could melt stone. The colony had a militia, a few hundred men and women with basic weapons and makeshift barriers, who stood their ground with what Zaelvok had to admit was admirable stupidity. They lasted about an hour. It was not even a battle in any meaningful sense of the word, and Zaelvok felt a twinge of disappointment as the last militia fighters were dragged away in restraints. He had hoped for something more interesting. The survivors were herded into the central agricultural dome, a massive structure of glass and steel, where the humans grew their crops under controlled conditions. Children cried, and parents held them close, and the old sat with quiet faces that revealed nothing. Landed his personal shuttle on the colony's main square, and stepped out into the warm air of this little world that now belonged to him. He walked among the humans on his way to the dome, towering over them, studying them with the cold curiosity of a scientist examining bacteria under glass. They looked back at him with eyes that held fear, yes, but also something else, something harder and more stubborn that he filed away for later consideration. "Fragile," he said to Thrak, who walked beside him with a plasma rifle cradled in his arms. "Absolutely fragile in every way that matters." Thrak nodded, because agreeing with the commander was the only career strategy that had ever worked aboard the silencing blade. The processing of prisoners was routine and boring, and exactly what Zaelvok expected. And he was about to return to his ship when a communication came through from a patrol unit sweeping the outer homesteads. "Commander," the patrol leader's voice crackled over the channel. "We have found something unusual at a farmhouse on the colony perimeter." "Define unusual," Zaelvok said, already uninterested. "A human child, Commander, very young, trapped under debris from a collapsed structure, still alive but injured and unable to move. Then retrieve it and bring it to the dome with the others." There was a pause that lasted just a little too long. "Commander, there is a creature with the child." Zaelvok raised one scaled brow. "What kind of creature?" We are not certain, sir. It is small, perhaps the size of a Vathir field ration pack, but it is positioned over the child and will not allow us to approach. A small animal is preventing a Vathir patrol from completing its objective, Zavok said flatly. Another pause. It has already bitten through Private Kesok's gauntlet, sir, and drawn blood. Significant blood. Zavok stared at the communicator in his hand. If it had just insulted his ancestry. He pulled up the patrol's helmet camera feed on his wrist display and saw the farmhouse, half collapsed. Beams and stones scattered everywhere, dust still hanging in the air. There in the middle of the wreckage was a small human girl, with dark hair and a face streaked with tears and dirt, her leg pinned at an angle that suggested it was broken or close to it. And crouched over her, its body between the child and the 3 armored Vathir soldiers, was the strangest creature Zavok had ever seen. It was stocky and low to the ground, with coarse black and silver fur, and a flat head, and small dark eyes that radiated something Zavok could only describe as pure and absolute fury. It was baring its teeth, which were, he noted with surprise, considerably larger and sharper than he would have expected from something that size. Every line of its small body screamed a single message that needed no translation across. Species or culture, or the vast emptiness of space between worlds. Come closer and I will make you regret every decision that led you to this moment. Zavok laughed. He laughed hard and honestly, the sound echoing across the ruined colony square. Because this was the funniest thing he had seen in a career that stretched across decades of blood and fire. A creature that weighed less than a Vathir combat boot was standing guard over a human child, against soldiers who had toppled civilizations. "Remove it," he said, still chuckling as he wiped a tear from one amber eye. "Kill it if you must. Just bring the child to processing." "Yes, Commander." 3 soldiers moved toward the rubble, their weapons raised, their confidence absolute. The creature did not flinch, and it did not run. The little girl behind it whispered through her tears, "Get them, Biscuit." And Sergeant Biscuit, 12 kilograms of Terran honey badger, with nothing to lose, and a child to protect, lowered his head, bared every single one of his teeth, and charged directly at the 3 armored aliens, like a furry missile launched from the depths of hell itself. Zavok stopped laughing. The medical report arrived on Zavok's personal screen 2 hours after the farmhouse incident, and he read it 3 times because he was certain there had been a mistake. Private Kesok had lost 2 fingers on his left hand, not broken, not dislocated, but bitten clean off through a combat gauntlet rated to withstand plasma shrapnel. Sergeant Drawl had deep lacerations across his face and neck, where the creature had somehow found the gaps between his armored scales and carved through the softer tissue underneath, like it had studied Vathir anatomy beforehand. The 3rd soldier, a veteran named Morvek, who had served in 9 planetary campaigns without complaint, had simply walked away from the farmhouse and refused to go back. When his squad leader demanded an explanation, Morvek had said 5 words that were already spreading through the ranks like a virus. That thing is not prey. Zavok sat alone in his command quarters aboard the silencing blade, and pulled up every file that Vathir intelligence had ever compiled on Terran fauna. He found the entry for the creature. Scientific name Mellivora capensis, common name honey badger, and began reading with the casual interest of someone skimming a menu. By the time he finished, the casual interest was gone, and something colder had taken its place. The honey badger was immune to most venoms on its homeworld, including the bites of snakes that could kill animals 50 times its size. Its skin was so thick and loose that even when a predator seized it in its jaws, the honey badger could twist its entire body around inside its own skin and bite the attacker in the face. It regularly attacked creatures many times larger than itself. The great cats of Earth, packs of scavengers, even the massive reptiles that shared its territory. And it did not attack them out of desperation or madness. It attacked them because it simply did not care about the size of its enemy. Human scientists had officially classified it as the most fearless animal on their planet, which was saying something, because Earth was apparently a world where nearly everything had spent millions of years trying to eat everything else. Zalevok leaned back in his chair and cross-referenced with human cultural databases. And this was where his unease deepened into something closer to genuine concern. The humans did not merely tolerate this creature, they celebrated it. They made images and jokes and stories about it across their communication networks. They gave it a reputation that bordered on mythology, laughing about its refusal to die and its willingness to fight anything, regardless of how suicidal that fight appeared. They thought it was funny. Zalevok had conquered species that worshipped war gods, and species that bred themselves for combat. But he had never encountered a species that looked at the most violent and stubborn creature on their world and found it hilarious. He closed the file and stared at the wall of his quarters for a long time. Down on the planet's surface, in the ruins of the farmhouse, the situation had not changed. The girl, her name was Mara, he had learned from the colony records, 6 years old, daughter of a farming engineer named Thomas Okafor, who was among the dead, lay in the rubble with her injured leg splinted by a piece of broken shelf that the honey badger had somehow shoved into position beside her. This detail had been in the patrol report, and Zalevok had read it twice, because it implied something that should have been impossible for a creature with a brain the size of a walnut. Sergeant Biscuit, as the child called him, had not left her side since the first encounter. The drone footage showed him dragging scraps of food from the destroyed kitchen to where Mara lay. Dried fruit, pieces of bread, a container of something that the scanners identified as peanut butter. He slept curled against her body at night, one eye always half open, and when Vathir surveillance drones passed overhead, he would look up at the sky and hiss at them with the raw hatred of a creature that had taken the entire alien invasion personally. Zalevok decided that the situation had gone on long enough, and it was beneath his dignity to be held at bay by an animal that could fit inside a standard supply crate. He sent a full squad of 8 soldiers, armored in heavy combat gear, equipped with stun weapons and suppression nets, and every tool designed for capturing dangerous fauna on hostile worlds. He watched through the drone feed as they approached the farmhouse in formation, professional and confident. 8 warriors who had collectively ended more lives than they could count. What happened next would be studied in Vathir military academies for years to come, though it would be filed under the category of incidents that must never be discussed outside this room. Sergeant Biscuit used the rubble like a battlefield. He disappeared into gaps between fallen beams that were too narrow for armored soldiers to follow. He emerged behind them, struck at the joints where their armor was weakest, the backs of knees, the inner elbows, the vulnerable spot where helmet met neck guard, and vanished again before they could bring their weapons to bear. He was hit by a stun blast, calibrated to drop a creature 3 times his mass, and it knocked him sideways into a pile of broken concrete. The squad leader reported the target was down. 4 seconds later, the target got up, shook himself like a wet dog, and bit the squad leader in the ankle so hard that the man screamed in a frequency that Zalevok had not known Vathir throats could produce. The fight lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of chaos in a ruined farmhouse against a single animal that weighed less than the ammunition belt on a standard Vathir rifle. The squad retreated. They did not walk back in an orderly fashion, and they did not provide tactical justification for their withdrawal. They ran. And through all of it, through every blast and shout and crash of rubble, the drone footage showed that Sergeant Biscuit never moved more than 3 meters from the child. Every attack was launched from a position between Mara and the soldiers. Every retreat circled back to her. Every snarl and bite and furious charge began and ended with the same simple geometry. The creature on one side, the child on the other, and nothing in the universe allowed to cross that line. Word spread through the Vaethir occupation force with the speed of fear. The soldiers did not whisper about the human militia that had fought and fallen in the first hour. They did not whisper about the prisoners in the dome, or the human fleet that might or might not be coming. Whispered about the farmhouse. They whispered about the small broken creature with one eye swelling shut, and blood on its fur that would not stop and could not be stopped, and did not seem to understand that it was supposed to be afraid. Zalevok sat alone in his quarters that night, and replayed the drone footage frame by frame. He watched the honey badger take the stun blast, and fall, and get up, and keep fighting, and he watched it drag food to a child that was not its offspring, not its species, not its anything in biological terms. He watched it position itself between danger and innocence, over and over and over again, with the mechanical precision of a soldier, following the only order it had ever been given: protect her. That was it. That was the entire strategy, the entire war plan, the entire reason for the creature's existence in that moment. Protect her, and keep protecting her, and never stop, no matter what comes through that door. Zalevok turned off the screen and sat in the dark. What kind of world, he said quietly to no one, makes something like that? On the morning of the second day, Zalevok went to the agricultural dome to speak with the prisoners, and what he found there disturbed him more than any battlefield he had ever walked. The humans had organized themselves, not in the way he expected. There were no weapons hidden in corners, no escape tunnels being dug through the floor, no secret meetings of resistance fighters plotting their next move. Instead, they had organized themselves around the simple and apparently unshakable principle that no one among them would suffer alone. The healthy were tending the wounded with strips of cloth torn from their own clothing. The adults had formed a ring around the area where the children sat, not as a barricade, but as a wall of warm bodies that said without words that anything wanting to reach these children would have to come through them first. The elderly had been given the softest places to rest, and the young men and women who could have used that comfort for themselves instead sat on cold metal floors without complaint. Zalevok walked among them with his guards, and watched all of this with the expression of someone trying to solve a math problem that refused to make sense. He stopped in front of a group of prisoners and asked to speak with someone who could explain something to him. They sent forward a woman named Dr. Lena Vasquez, a biologist with calm dark eyes and a bruise across her forehead from the initial invasion. Zalevok asked her about the creature at the farmhouse. Dr. Vasquez studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to tell an alien warlord about the things that made her species what it was, and then she began to talk. She explained the Terran Biodiversity Initiative, a program that had been running since humanity first left Earth and began settling other worlds. Every human colony carried with it not just seeds and livestock and the practical ingredients of survival, but a complete sample of Earth's living heritage. Forests were planted on alien soil, rivers were stocked with fish from Terran oceans, and animals of every kind were brought along. Not just the useful ones, but the wild ones, the dangerous ones, the ones that served no economic purpose whatsoever. Wolves and bears and eagles, and yes, honey badgers. Why? Zalevok asked, and the single word carried the weight of genuine confusion from a being who had spent his life eliminating anything that did not serve the expansion of the Dominion. Dr. Vasquez smiled at him, the way a teacher smiles at a student who has just asked the most important question of the semester. Because they are ours, she said. Because wherever we go, we bring our whole world with us, the beautiful parts and the parts that bite. Zalevok stared at her. That is inefficient, he said. Yes, she agreed, It is. The creature at the farmhouse has injured multiple soldiers and disrupted a military operation, and you kept it as, what, a pet? Sergeant Biscuit is not a pet, Dr. Vasquez said with a slight edge in her voice. He is a companion, and there is a difference that your translators may not be able to capture. Explain the difference. A pet is something you keep. A companion is something that chooses to stay. Zalvok had no answer for this, and he did not like having no answers. So he changed the subject and asked about human military capabilities, which was the question he had originally come to ask before this woman and her calm eyes derailed him. But the answers to his military questions came in forms he did not expect. He asked about weapons and fleet strength and tactical doctrine, and the prisoners gave him vague and probably dishonest answers, which was fine and expected. What they gave him that they did not mean to give was everything else. He watched a woman sit with a dying man, militia fighter, who had taken a plasma burn to the chest in the first hour, and was slowly losing his fight, and hold his hand and talk to him in a soft voice about a lake on Earth where he had gone fishing as a boy. She was not his wife, or his sister, or anyone connected to him by blood. She was a stranger who had decided that no one in this dome would die alone. He watched two injured men spend 3 hours repairing a cracked section of the dome wall, not because it would help them escape, but because cold air was leaking through the crack onto a group of elderly prisoners who were shivering in the night. The men used pieces of broken farming equipment and their own torn shirts to seal the gap, and when they were done, they sat down on the cold floor and did not ask for thanks. He watched a teenage girl draw pictures in the dirt with a stick for a group of small children who were too frightened to sleep, making up stories about brave animals and magical forests, while the Vaethir guards loomed in the background like monuments to everything wrong with the universe. And he heard singing. A woman with a voice that cracked at the edges from thirst and exhaustion was singing to a cluster of children pressed against her sides, and the song was in a human language that Zalvok's translator rendered imperfectly as something about stars and dreams and a promise that morning would come. His officers shifted uncomfortably when they heard it, and Zalvok noticed this and filed it away as significant, because the singing was not a weapon, and yet it was doing something to his soldiers that weapons had not done. It was reminding them that the things in this dome were not resources to be processed or enemies to be broken. They were people, and they were afraid, and they were taking care of each other with a tenderness that had no tactical value, and no strategic purpose, and no logical reason to exist in a situation this hopeless. And yet there it was, stubborn and irrational and absolutely unbreakable, like a small creature standing over a child in the ruins of a farmhouse. Zalvok left the dome and walked outside into the colony's artificial daylight, and stood there for a while, breathing air that smelled like burned buildings and alien wheat. The honey badger was not an anomaly. He understood that now. It was not a freak occurrence, not a malfunction of nature, not some bizarre accident of evolution that had produced a single creature too stupid to know when it was beaten. The honey badger was a mirror. It reflected exactly what the humans were. A species that bonded with everything it touched, that protected things weaker than itself at any cost, that refused to stop caring even when caring was the most dangerous thing it could do. And the creatures around them absorbed this, like soil absorbs rain. The dogs that humans carried to the stars learned to love them and guard them and grieve when they died. The cats learned to curl against them in the dark when the nightmares came. The horses learned to carry them into battle and not run even when every animal instinct screamed to flee. And the honey badgers learned that a small human child crying in the rubble was worth more than their own survival, worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth standing against an empire for. A priority message arrived from Vathir High Command, and Seilvok read it on his personal screen while standing in the shadow of the dome. The human navy had been alerted to the colony's fall, and a response fleet was being assembled somewhere in the systems that humans called home. High Command was not concerned, because human military technology was considered inferior to Vathir systems in most measurable categories. Attached to the report was a footnote, an intelligence analyst summary of human military history that some desk officer had included, probably out of routine thoroughness. Seilvok read it. Then he read it again. Humans had been waging war against each other since before they had metal tools. They had fought with sticks and stones, and then with swords and arrows, and then with chemical explosives, and then with weapons that could split atoms and poison entire continents for generations. They had come within a breath of destroying themselves, not once, but several times, and each single time, something had pulled them back from the edge. They had looked into the abyss of their own extinction and said, "No, not today, we are not done yet." And then they had kept fighting. Not because they loved war, the analyst noted with what read almost like bewilderment, but because they loved the things behind them, the children and the songs and the lakes where old men fished, and the drawings in the dirt, and the creatures that chose to stay. Seilvok pulled up the drone feed from the farmhouse one more time. Mara was asleep, curled on her side in the rubble, her injured legs still, and her breathing steady. Sergeant Biscuit was awake. He sat beside her in the darkness with his battered body and his one good eye, watching the night, watching for threats, tireless and unbroken, and ready to fight the entire galaxy if it tried to take one step closer to this child. Seilvok turned to Thrak, who stood waiting for orders by the door. "We may have made an error," the commander said quietly. Thrak waited for elaboration. By the third day of the occupation, Seilvok's army was falling apart, and the humans had not fired a single shot. It began with the guards. The Vathir soldiers assigned to watch the prisoners in the agricultural dome had been trained for hostile environments, for riots and escape attempts, and the cold mathematics of keeping conquered populations under control. They had not been trained for what the humans were doing. The humans were talking to them, not shouting or threatening or bargaining for their freedom, just talking, in the ordinary way that people talk to other people when they are stuck in the same room with nothing to do. A young human man asked one of the guards what his name was, and the guard, whose training said to ignore all prisoner communication, answered before he realized what he was doing. His name was Selcott, and he had been a soldier for 11 years, and he did not know why he had told this human anything. Woman offered a guard a piece of dried fruit from the rations that had been distributed, and the guard refused because accepting food from prisoners was against regulations. And then 10 minutes later he came back and took it, because the old woman had left it on the ground near his post, with a small nod that somehow contained more warmth than anything Selcott had experienced in 11 years of military service. A human mother showed a guard a drawing her daughter had made with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of metal. A picture of a house with a yellow sun, and 2 stick figures holding hands. And the guard stared at it for a very long time, and then quietly requested a transfer to perimeter patrol, where he would not have to look at human children anymore. The reports coming to Seilvok's desk were not about resistance or rebellion. They were about his own soldiers asking to be reassigned away from the dome, because something about the prisoners was making them feel things that Vathir soldiers were not supposed to feel. One sergeant reported that he had overheard a human woman singing to a group of children about something called a rainbow, and that he had been unable to sleep afterward because he kept thinking about his own offspring back on the Vathir homeworld and wondering whether anyone was singing to them. Seilvok read this report and said a word in Vathir that had no direct human translation, but meant something close to, "This is becoming a problem that weapons cannot solve." The morale collapse was not violent or dramatic. It was quiet and steady, like water seeping through cracks in a wall. Vaethir soldiers were trained to conquer species that did one of three things: fight, flee, or submit. The humans were doing all three at once, and none of them completely. They resisted without violence by simply being so relentlessly, aggressively kind that the guards could not maintain the emotional distance necessary to treat them as conquered subjects. They submitted to the physical reality of their captivity without breaking. The spirit behind their eyes remained intact and burning like a flame in a glass jar that the wind could not reach. They looked for ways to escape, not through tunnels or force, but through connection. They were slowly, gently, impossibly turning their captors into people who did not want to be captors anymore. And the Vaethir had absolutely no protocol for this. On the morning of the third day, Zaelvok did something that surprised even himself. He went to the farmhouse, alone. No soldiers, no weapons, no drones, just a 7-foot reptilian warlord walking across a field of alien wheat toward a pile of rubble where a child and a honey badger had been holding off his empire for 3 days. He did not fully understand why he was doing this, and he suspected that if he examined his motivations too closely, he would not like what he found. The farmhouse was quiet in the early light, and the air smelled like dust and the faint sweetness of crushed grain from the fields around it. Zaelvok stopped about 10 meters away and waited. Sergeant Biscuit emerged from the rubble within seconds, as if he had been listening for footsteps, which, Zaelvok realized, he probably had been. The honey badger placed himself in the gap between two fallen beams that formed the only approach to where Mara lay sleeping. He was in terrible shape. One eye was swollen completely shut, and the fur on his right side was matted with dried blood from the stun blast impact. He was limping on his front left leg, where a piece of debris had caught him during the second assault. His body was a map of the last 3 days. Every wound, every bruise, every scar a record of what it cost to stand between a child and an army. And he was growling, low and steady and continuous, like an engine that had been running since the invasion began, and would not stop until it burned itself out completely or the threat went away, whichever came first. Zaelvok crouched down, bringing himself closer to the creature's eye level, and for a long moment, two beings from opposite ends of the galaxy studied each other across a distance of 10 meters and 1,000,000 years of evolution. The commander had looked into the eyes of enemy generals and rebel leaders and kings of dying civilizations, and he had always seen something he recognized: ambition or fear or hatred or the cold calculations of survival. In the honey badger's one good eye, he saw none of these things. He saw something simpler and more terrifying than all of them combined. He saw absolute and total refusal. Not courage, because courage implied the possibility of retreat. Not rage, because rage eventually burned itself out. Just refusal, pure and clean and bottomless, the kind of refusal that did not negotiate or calculate or weigh its options, because there were no options to weigh. The child was behind him, and the enemy was in front of him, and the math was that simple and that final. Zaelvok had seen this before. He had seen it in the greatest warriors of the Vaethir Dominion, in the legends of his own people, in the stories told to young soldiers about what it meant to stand and not move, when everything in the universe was telling you to run. But he had never seen it in something this small. And he had never seen it in defense of something this fragile. He stood up slowly and looked past the honey badger to where Mara was sleeping in the rubble, her face peaceful in a way that made no sense given what surrounded her. And he understood that she was peaceful because Sergeant Biscuit was there, and she trusted him completely and absolutely the way that only a child can trust, without doubt, without reservation, without the complicated machinery of adult fear. Zelvok turned around and walked back to his shuttle. He did not take the child. He did not give any order regarding the farmhouse. He sat in the pilot's seat of his shuttle and stared at the control panel for an hour without moving. And when Thrak nervously asked if everything was all right, the commander said nothing. The alert came 6 hours later. Human warships, 17 of them, dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the star system with the synchronized precision of a blade being drawn from its sheath. It was not the small and poorly equipped response force that Vathir intelligence had predicted. It was the Third Soul Battle Group, veterans of campaigns on the Outer Rim, hardened crews and ships that bore the scars of fights they had won against odds that should have killed them. And they were broadcasting on every frequency, every channel, every wavelength that could carry a signal across the void of. The message was not a threat, and it was not a demand, and it was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, repeated over and over in a flat, calm voice that carried more weight than any war cry Zavok had ever heard. You have our children. We are coming to get them. You will not stop us. The space battle erupted within minutes, and it was nothing like what the Vathir expected. Human ships were inferior in shielding, weapons range, and raw firepower. The intelligence reports had been correct about that. What the intelligence reports had failed to capture was what humans did when their technology was not enough. They closed the distance. They drove their ships directly into the teeth of Vathir weapons fire, taking hits that should have been fatal, absorbing damage that should have crippled them, and they kept coming. A human frigate with half its hull torn open and fires burning across 3 decks rammed itself into the engine section of a Vathir cruiser and detonated its remaining weapons at point-blank range, destroying both ships in a flash of light that was visible from the planet's surface. A squadron of human fighters, outnumbered 4-1, flew a pattern so reckless and unpredictable that the Vathir targeting systems could not track them. And in the chaos, they destroyed 2 escort ships before a single fighter was lost. The Vathir fleet, which had expected a brief and clinical exercise in superior firepower, began to bleed. Zalvok stood on the colony's surface and watched the flashes of light in the sky above him, each one a ship dying, each one a crew of beings from one world or another ceasing to exist in a moment of fire and silence. His second-in-command ran to him with reports and requests for orders and tactical options. Zalvok looked at Thrak, and then looked toward the horizon, where the farmhouse sat invisible in the distance, and he said the words that would end his military career and save 4,000 human lives. They are all honey badgers, Thrak, every last one of them. The human marines came down from the sky like stones thrown by an angry god. Their drop pods punched through the atmosphere in clusters of 4, trailing fire and smoke, and they hit the ground running before the dust had settled around them. They did not fight the way the Vathir expected. Vathir military doctrine was built on rigid formations, overlapping fields of fire, and a chain of command that flowed from the top down like water through a pipe, ordered, predictable, and efficient. The humans fought like the honey badger. They broke into small squads that moved through the colony's streets and buildings with a fluid coordination that looked like chaos but was not. Each squad operated independently, reading the terrain, adapting to conditions in real time, making decisions without waiting for orders from above, because human soldiers were trained to think and not just to obey. They used the buildings as cover, and the narrow streets as funnels, and they turned every intersection into a trap that cost the Vathir soldiers who walked into it. A Vathir officer later described it in his report as fighting smoke. Every time you thought you had them contained, they poured through the gaps and appeared behind you. And they were angry, not with the hot and careless anger that makes soldiers sloppy and reckless, but with the cold and focused anger of people who had been told that their children were in danger, and had spent 3 days crossing the void of space with nothing to do but think about that. A Marine sergeant was recorded on his helmet camera saying one sentence to his squad before they breached the perimeter of the agricultural dome. "Our kids are in there." That was all it took. Inside the dome, the prisoners heard the fighting outside, the crack of human weapons, the heavier thud of Vathir return fire, the shouts in 2 languages neither of which was interested in. And they began to move. Not in panic, and not in a rush, but with the calm, deliberate coordination of people who had been preparing for this moment since the day they were herded into this glass building. The old terraforming engineer, the one who had laughed about Sergeant Biscuit on the first day, stood up from where he had been sitting for 3 days and pulled a wrench from behind a water recycling unit, where he had hidden it 48 hours ago. Others produced tools from similar hiding places, pieces of metal sharpened against the concrete floor, lengths of wire stripped from the irrigation systems, heavy containers that could be swung with enough force to matter. They had not tried to escape, because escape without support was suicide, and humans were many things, but they were not wasteful with their lives when patience offered better odds. Now the support had arrived, and patience was over. The engineer looked at the Vathir guards, who stood at the dome's exits, and smiled the way a man smiles when he has been sitting still for 3 days by choice, and the choice has just changed. The guards were overwhelmed in less than 10 minutes. No one was killed, because the humans had agreed among themselves, quietly, in whispers over the past 2 days, that killing the guards would make them no different from the army outside, and they refused to become that, even in the moment of their liberation. The guards were restrained with the same wire and tools that the humans had prepared, and Dr. Vasquez made sure each one was checked for injuries afterward, because she was a doctor, and that was what doctors did, regardless of whose blood was on the floor. Outside, the battle turned. The Vathir ground forces had been positioned for occupation, not defense, and the human Marines exploited this with the precision of a species that had been studying the art of war since before the Vathir had discovered fire. Squad by squad, block by block, the colony was retaken, and at the edge of the settlement, far from the main fighting, a 4-person Marine squad was dispatched to the coordinates of a farmhouse that had been flagged in the initial mission briefing, with a priority marker and a note that read, "One child, 6 years old, named Mara Okafor, believed alive, protected by Terran companion animal, approach with care." The squad leader was a woman named Corporal Danny Reeves, who had a daughter, roughly the same age as Mara, back on Earth, and who had volunteered for this specific objective the moment she saw the briefing. They approached the farmhouse at dawn, with weapons lowered and voices soft, and Corporal Reeves called out in a gentle tone that she normally reserved for her own child waking from a bad dream. "Mara, sweetheart, we are here. You are safe now. We are human, and we are here to take you home." There was silence from the rubble, and then a small voice, hoarse and dry, but very much alive. "Biscuit does not like strangers." "That is okay," Reeves said. "We are not strangers. We are family, and we brought water and food and a medic, and we are not leaving without you." Another silence, and then a rustling from the ruins, as Mara shifted her position. Sergeant Biscuit emerged first. He stood in the gap between the beams and looked at the 4 armed Marines with his one good eye. And what happened next was something that Corporal Reeves would later describe in her official report as the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed in 12 years of military service. The honey badger studied them. He looked at their faces and their posture and their lowered weapons and the way Reeves was crouching down to make herself smaller and less threatening. And something in his battered and exhausted brain performed a calculation that no one would ever be able to fully explain. Individuals. He had never seen these people before in his life. but as pack. They were the same kind of creature as the small girl behind him, the same kind of creature as the man named Thomas, who had given him his name and fed him every morning, and scratched the spot behind his ears that made his back leg twitch. They were humans, and humans meant safety. And for the first time in 3 days, Sergeant Biscuit's war was over. He relaxed. His body, which had been a coiled spring of aggression and defiance since the first Vather boot touched the colony soil, simply unwound. He turned away from the Marines without fear, walked back to Mara, and licked her face with a tenderness that made Corporal Reeves press her hand over her mouth, because she was a Marine, and Marines were not supposed to cry on mission. The medic moved in and stabilized Mara's leg, while Reeves held the girl in her arms, and Sergeant Biscuit sat beside them both, finally allowing his one good eye to close because someone else was standing guard now, and he could rest. Across the colony, the fighting was ending. Zalevok stood in the command center he had established in the colony's administrative building, and watched his tactical display turn red, zone by zone, as human Marines secured the settlement. His fleet in orbit was losing. 3 capital ships destroyed, 2 more critically damaged, the rest falling back toward the system's edge in a retreat that High Command would later call tactical repositioning, and everyone else would call running. Thrak stood beside him with the expression of a man watching a building collapse from the inside. "Commander," he said, "standard protocol for a failed subjugation requires orbital bombardment of the surface to deny the enemy any strategic value from the—" "No," Zalevok said. Thrak blinked. "Commander, the regulations are clear. When a conquest cannot be completed, Thrak." The word hung in the air between them, like a door closing. Zalevok walked to the communication console and opened a channel to the human fleet commander on a frequency that both sides used for diplomatic communication. "I am Commander Zalevok of the Vaethir Dominion," he said, his voice steady and calm, and carrying the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. "I wish to discuss terms for the cessation of hostilities and the return of all prisoners and territory." The human fleet commander, an admiral named Catherine Park, who had not slept in 3 days and had chewed through the cap of every pen on her bridge, responded in 4 words, "We accept your surrender." Zalevok did not argue with the word surrender, even though it would brand him a disgrace in Vaethir history, because he had seen what these people were, and he knew that any other choice would simply mean more death for both sides, and he was tired of death, in a way that he had not been tired of it before. When Thrak asked him why break protocol, why end a fight that could still be fought, why surrender when the regulations demanded scorched earth, Zalevok told him something that Thrak would remember for the rest of his life. "Because a creature the size of my boot stood against our entire army for 3 days to protect a child that was not its own, and it did this because it learned how from the humans. And if that is what their animals become, then I do not want to find out what they become when we take their children from them permanently." In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed in small but permanent ways. Mara was reunited with her mother, a Daisy Okafor, who had been among the Dome prisoners, and who held her daughter so tightly that the medics had to gently remind her that the girl still had a broken leg. Sergeant Biscuit refused to leave Mara's side during the reunion, and growled at the first medic who tried to separate them, which everyone agreed was both predictable and appropriate. He was formally adopted into the Okafor family and given a veterinary examination that revealed 4 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, severe bruising across most of his body, and damage to his left eye that would leave him partially blind for life. The veterinarian noted in her file that despite these injuries, the animal's overall condition was remarkably good for a creature that fought a 3-day war against a technologically superior alien military. And added a personal note that read, "This is the toughest patient I have ever treated, and I once operated on a horse that had been struck by lightning." Zalevok's surrender was received by Vaethir High Command with the kind of cold fury that empires reserve for those who embarrass them. He was stripped of his rank and recalled for court-martial, proceedings that he endured with the quiet dignity of a man who had stopped caring about the opinions of people who had not been there. He requested permission to conduct a formal study of human-animal bonding and its implications for Vaethir military strategy, and this request was denied, with language that suggested his superiors considered him mentally compromised. He wrote the study anyway. It circulated quietly through Vaethir academic and intelligence networks under the title On the Symbiotic Madness of Humans and the Implications for Dominion Strategy. And it contained a passage that would be quoted in classrooms, war colleges, and diplomatic briefings for generations. Any species that can convince the most aggressive creature on their homeworld to love their children is not a species that can be conquered. They will simply refuse to be, and everything around them, every beast, every ally, every atom of their stubborn and irrational being, will refuse alongside them. The Vaethir Dominion quietly cancelled all further military operations. Operations against human space. The official reason was strategic reprioritization. The unofficial reason was a 12-kilogram animal with one good eye and cracked ribs who had held the line against an empire and won. 1 year later, Outpost Kepler 9c stood rebuilt and green under its alien sun. The fields of engineered wheat rippled in a warm breeze, and the new dome, larger and stronger than the one before, gleamed in the afternoon light. Mara Okafor, now 7 years old and walking with only a slight limp that the doctor said would fade with time, ran through the wheat field with her arms spread wide, and her laughter carried across the colony like music. Beside her, keeping pace with his lopsided gait, and his one good eye scanning the field for threats that were no longer there, but might be someday, because you never knew, and it was best to be ready, ran Sergeant Biscuit. He was slower now, and he would never be what he was before. Still sharp, and his spirit was still the same unbreakable thing it had always been. And Mara loved him with the fierce and uncomplicated love that children have for the creatures who keep them safe in the dark. Above them, in the evening sky turning gold and violet, with the setting of a star that was not Earth's sun, but was home nonetheless, a Vaethir diplomatic vessel entered orbit. It was the first Vaethir ship to visit a human colony in peace, and it carried a trade delegation and a cultural exchange team, and, buried in the personal luggage of the delegation's leader, a small wrapped gift for a girl named Mara, from a disgraced former commander who had never forgotten the farmhouse. Mara looked up at the ship in the sky and waved with both hands. Sergeant Biscuit looked up at the ship in the sky and growled. Some things never change.